Welcome to Anews. I'm Umar Taslim, and you're watching Turkey's Diplomacy. Today on the program, I'll be joined by Anews editor Mustafa Kocakenar and Issue Insights senior research editor John Kavulich to discuss the PKK terror group's disarmament process, the latest meetings between Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu and US President Donald Trump, and the future of Israel's war in Gaza.
Vatanımız uğrunda canlarını feda etmiş tüm şehitlerimizi de rahmetle anıyor. Gazilerimize şükranlarımı sunuyorum.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan participated in the AK Party group meeting in the capital Ankara on Wednesday.
Terörsüz Türkiye çalışmalarının hiçbir yerinde şehitlerimizin hatırasına gölge düşürecek, onların ruhunu incitecek bir adım yoktur ve olamaz.
The Turkish president's remarks come amid growing momentum for Turkey's Terror-Free Türkiye initiative, which aims to end decades of armed conflict through a strategy centered on disarmament, democratic engagement, and national solidarity.
Önce terörsüz Türkiye, ardından terörsüz bölge hedefimize ulaşarak şehitlerimizin ruhlarını şad edecek, onların fedakarlıklarının boşa gitmediğini dost düşman herkese göstereceğiz.
The Terror-Free Initiative represents not just the end of conflict, but the beginning of a new chapter in Turkey's history, one that is characterized by peace, security, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow for all its people.
Şehitlerimizin uğruna can verdiği değerlerin rehberliğinde Türkiye'yi inşallah yarım asırlık bir musibetten kurtarıyor, ülkemizin ayağına vurulmuş bu kanlı prangayı tamamen söküp atıyoruz.
He warned against potential sabotage attempts by shady and corrupt circles, calling for vigilance and unity to ensure that the historic opportunity for lasting peace and stability is not derailed.
Önümüzdeki günlerde olumlu haberlerin alınacağı bir evreye giriyoruz. Bu hayırlı sürecin herhangi bir yol kazası yaşanmadan, karanlık ve kirli mahfiller tarafından sabote edilmesine fırsat vermeden mümkün olan en kısa sürede başarıyla neticelenmesini temenni ediyoruz.
Welcome back to the program. Anews editor Mustafa Kocakenar, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Omar.
Mustafa, let's start with the PKK terror group, its disarmament, its dissolution. Now, today is the day that everyone was waiting for. The PKK terror group in Iraq, in the city of Suleimania, is laying down its arms, its weapons, and it's going to dissolve. Now, Mustafa, this group has killed over 40,000 women and children and other civilians as well inside Turkey, and the operations and the terrorist activities that it has undertaken are not just restricted to Turkey. So how important is this, Mustafa, today, this entire event that's happening today in Iraq?
Omar, I think if we want to understand the current situation, we have to delve into the process. And since 1984, PKK terror group has been waging a bloody terror campaign against Turkey's national security and territorial integrity. As you know, PKK terrorists have been murdering more than 40,000 people, including civilians, women and children. And PKK terror group has been pursuing a separatist terrorist agenda within the country. And Turkish security forces successfully conducted countless counter-terrorism operations against PKK within and beyond Turkey's borders. And Turkish security forces totally eliminate the PKK terror threat within the country. And as you know, last year, Turkey's opposition Nationalist Movement Party leader Devlet Bahçeli initiated Terror-Free Türkiye campaign. And since then, both the ruling AK Party and opposition parties have been taking steps to realize the government's Terror-Free Türkiye initiative. As you know, in February, PKK terror groups jailed ringleader Abdullah Öcalan called upon the separatist terror group to dissolve itself and lay down the weapons. And in May, PKK announced its decision to disband itself and lay down their weapons. And today, some PKK terror members located in northern Iraq, Süleymaniye province, are preparing to lay down their weapons. Whether it is symbolic or concrete, I think it is expected to yield positive results in terms of ensuring Turkey's national security and political sovereignty. We know that Turkish political leaders and security forces are meticulously following the latest developments about the dissolution process of the PKK terror group. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan reiterates that Turkey will continue to take new steps to realize terror-free Turkey initiative. I think that terror-free Turkey also means terror-free region, and there will be ramifications for regional security and peace, I think.
Mustafa, I was going to, ask you about that as well. What are the ramifications for the region? Because you said that the threat of the PKK in Turkey does not exist anymore, but when you look at the region, when you look at northern Iraq and northern Syria, there are groups like the SDF, and then there's PJAK, for example, in Iran. Now, how are these countries going to sort out this issue? And especially when we know that Syria, the Syrian government, the SDF, the PKK, YPG-backed SDF, is now starting to integrate within the Syrian government. So how are both of these countries looking at the situation there? What about the branches of the PKK terror organization?
Omar, we know that PKK terror group is not only operating in Turkey, they are also active in northern Iraq and northern Syria. And since the very beginning of the terror threat in the region, Turkey has been expecting concrete steps from its neighbors in terms of addressing security challenges posed by the PKK terror group. As you know, in Syria, geopolitical landscape totally changed last December as the opposition forces led by Ahmet al-Shara took control over the country. And since then, new rulers in Syria have been taking important steps in terms of normalizing the political situation in the northern part of the country. And in March, as you mentioned, that PYD-YPG dominated SDF reached an agreement with new rulers in Damascus, and new rulers and new Syrian security forces have been taking control over the northern part of the country. On the other hand, we know that PKK terror groups, Syrian offshoot PYD-YPG and PKK terrorists located in the northern Iraq are posing huge threat to these countries' political sovereignty and economic prosperity. Within this context, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, Turkish National Defense Minister Yaşar Güler, and Turkish Intelligence Chief Ibrahim Kalın have been in close contact with their Iraqi and Syrian counterparts to discuss what can be done in terms of ensuring long-standing and sustainable peace and tranquility on the borders among Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. I think that there will be ramifications for regional security and peace. I think collaboration and cooperation among these countries will yield positive results in terms of bringing peace and tranquility to the region.
Mustafa, what about the American support for terror groups? Because we've seen President Erdogan say on a number of occasions that the United States cannot support one terror group and fight another terror group with it. So how are you looking at the American support for terror groups in this region, and what have we learned from the lessons that we've seen in the past?
Omar, as you know, during the civil war years in Syria, Daesh terror group benefited from the geopolitical vacuum in the northern part of the country. And during the Obama administration, the United States was looking for local forces to deal with the Daesh threat, and they decided to use PKK terror groups, Syrian offshoot PYD, YPG, as proxy forces to cope with the security challenges in the region. But since the very beginning of the crisis, Turkish decision makers have been reiterating that one terror group cannot be defeated by using another one. And as you know, Turkey also conducted its own counterterrorism operations against Daesh in 2016. And with the Operation Euphrates Shields, Turkey totally obliterated Daesh terror threat in the region. And Turkey started to call upon its NATO ally, United States, to cut its ties with PKK terror group, Syrian offshoot PYD, YPG, because the United States is also recognizing PKK as the terror group, but they called them SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces forces. They changed the names of terror groups to hide their support for the terror groups. On the other hand, we know that the United States used PYD, YPG under the pretext of fight against Daesh. And then Turkey claimed that we totally eliminated Daesh threats, so you are supposed to cut your ties with the PKK terror group, Syria and offshore. But they didn't cut their ties with terror groups in the region. They are still sending weapons and ammunition to the PKK terror group, Syrian branch, PYD, YPG. And it is clearly poisoning the bilateral relationships between two important allies, because Turkey and the United States are supposed to address shared security challenges as NATO allies. I think that new process will also help both Ankara and Washington normalize their bilateral relationships in the fight against terror. I think that, Turkey also conducted several counterterrorism operations against PYD, YPG in northern Syria. Operation Olive Branch, Operation Peace Spring, and Operation Spring Shield dealt heavily PYD, YPG terror group. I think PYD, YPG, if PYD, YPG tries to establish a separate structure from the Syrian state in the northern part of the country, I think Turkish security forces will be compelled to conduct another counterterrorism operations in the region in terms of ensuring Turkey's national security and territorial integrity, because Turkish decision makers think that if there is any separate structure controlled by terror groups in the region, it will pose a huge threat to Turkey's political stability, national sovereignty and territorial integrity. I think Turkish security forces are determined to take new steps in terms of upholding peace and tranquility in Turkey's borders.
Musa, what happens to the Syria-Israel issue? Because in the last few months we saw Israel attacking military facilities in Syria, and we've also heard that the Syrian government says that we could engage in negotiations with the Israeli government. So where do we stand exactly when it comes to Israel and Syria rebuilding their ties?
Umar, as you know, since the very beginning of the new geopolitical era in Syria, Turkey is one of the most important countries supporting Syria's territorial integrity and political sovereignty. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan welcomed several times Ahmet al-Shara to Istanbul, Ankara and Antalya. The Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan always reaffirmed Turkey's strong support for Syria's efforts to rebuild and reconstruct the country. Turkish decision makers have been also in close contact with their Syrian counterparts in terms of exchanging views on the latest political developments in the country. We know that Turkey's increasing geopolitical influence in Syria is pushing Israel's buttons. As you know, Netanyahu went to the United States in April to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump, and Netanyahu is clearly seeking the United States help to deal with the Turkey's geopolitical influence in the region. But on the contrary to expectations of Netanyahu, Donald Trump publicly sided with Turkey and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and he called on Netanyahu to be reasonable if Israel wants to deal with its bilateral or multilateral problems with Turkey in front of the international media. As you also mentioned that Israel is targeting Syria's military infrastructure. We know that Israel is still occupying Golan Heights in the region. It is clearly showing that tensions are rising between Turkey and Israel over Syria. But right now, Azerbaijan is hosting some talks between Turkish and Israeli decision makers in terms of de-escalating the rising geopolitical tensions in the region. On the other hand, Turkish decision makers, Turkish foreign policy makers have been reiterating that Turkey doesn't want any military confrontation with Israel over Syria. I think that both Turkey and Israel will find a common way or common sense in terms of ensuring Syria's political sovereignty and territorial integrity. Otherwise, there will be rising geopolitical tensions, and it will not yield positive results in terms of ensuring long-standing and sustainable peace and tranquility in the region.
Well, so this week, the Turkish foreign minister was in Pakistan. Hakan Fidan met his counterpart, Ishaq Dar. He also met the Pakistani Prime Minister, Shehbaz Sharif. And they discussed multiple things. There was trade on the table, there was terrorism, and especially I want to talk about terrorism. They discussed the fight against Daesh, PKK and also FETÖ. So how are you looking at this collaboration between the two countries? And it's not new. It has been happening for a number of years. So what do you think about this, Mustafa? How important is this that both Pakistan and Turkey are on the same page when it comes to fighting terrorism?
Umar, as you mentioned, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan and Turkish National Defense Minister Yaşar Güler paid an official visit to Pakistan this week to discuss bilateral ties between Ankara and Islamabad and exchange views on the latest regional and global security challenges. Hakan Fidan praised Pakistan's strong support for Turkey's fight against terrorism, including FETÖ, Daesh, PYD, YPG, and PKK. As you know, Pakistan is always supporting Turkey's territorial integrity and political sovereignty. Both countries are collaborating in the international arena to deal with the security challenges. On the other hand, you know, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Pakistani Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif went to Azerbaijan twice this year to discuss regional and international security challenges. We know that one nation, two states motto is defining the strategic cooperation between Turkey and Azerbaijan. And right now, Pakistan is also joining the brotherhood between Turkey and Azerbaijan. I think it will yield positive results in terms of bringing long-standing peace and tranquility to the wider Eurasia region. I think that cooperation and collaboration among Turkey, Azerbaijan and Pakistan will continue to be on the international agenda, and I think that Pakistan will continue to reaffirm its strong support for Turkey's fight against terrorism, all kinds of terrorist groups in the region.
Mustafa, from Pakistan to Europe, now there are some countries which have been harboring terrorists from FETÖ, PKK, YPG, and all these other terrorist organizations which are found predominantly in this region. Now, countries like Germany and Sweden have shown support for the PKK terror group. What happens to those terror group leaders or branches that are in Europe right now? Because now that the PKK is disarming and dissolving, what happens to those groups? Obviously, FETÖ is a different group, PKK is a different group, Daesh is a separate group. But what happens to, all of these groups collaboratively? Do you think that there's no point in extending, whatever their cause was?
Umar, as you know, Turkey and the European nations have ups and downs in their relationships in the historical process. And Turkey has been always calling upon its Western allies and European allies within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to take concrete steps against all kinds of terror groups within their countries. We know that FETÖ and PKK terror members are freely roaming across the European cities. Turkish decision makers have been always criticizing the European attitude towards the fight against terrorism because we know that these nations are Turkey's allies within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and they are supposed to take concrete steps against terror groups recognized by Turkey, the European Union, and the United States. European Union is also recognizing PKK as the terror group. But as you also mentioned that PKK terrorists are benefiting from the hypocrisy by the European nations. I think that Turkey will continue to take new diplomatic steps in terms of convincing its European allies to cut their ties with PKK terror group or FETÖ terror group. I think that this process will also help both Turkey and European nations deal with shared security challenges in the region.
Mustafa, can we say, like how we saw in the past as well, there were some terrorists who were extradited as well to Turkey? You mentioned that we could have a similar process. So do you think that these terrorists could be extradited to Turkey once again if the Turkish government is involved in negotiations with these countries?
Mar, as you know that some European nations are extraditing some terror groups to Turkey, but Turkey is expecting more concrete steps against terror groups located in the European nations. I think that Turkish decision makers will be in close contact with their European counterparts to discuss what can be done against shared security challenges. I think that Turkey will be able to convince their allies within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to take some concrete steps against PKK terror group or Gülenist terrorist organization. We will also mark the anniversary of July 15 coup attempt next week. I think Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan will also mention about this issue. Turkey is expecting some steps from its Western or Asian allies in terms of fighting terrorism. I think that Turkey's diplomatic actions and new steps will yield positive results in terms of ensuring international peace and security, because we know that these terrorist organizations are not only posing huge threat to Turkey's national security and political sovereignty, they are also targeting peace on the international level.
Mustafa, thanks for that analysis. We'll be right back with you. Now let's take a look at this news report about the Srebrenica genocide, and we'll be right back.
Mevlida Omerovic's husband was among the thousands of Bosnian Muslims murdered in the 1995 Srebrenica massacre. His partial remains, pieces of his jawbone, were uncovered and identified in a mass grave 12 years ago. Omerovic did not bury them at the time, in hope more might emerge, but none did. Now she will bury what she has in a cemetery for Srebrenica victims, where 6,750 are already interred.
I had 2 children with him. We were happy. We had a nice life. But everything that is nice is short-lived. I only have a memory of him now, and these 2 children are nothing more. He was a good, peaceful man. What else can I say?
In the war that followed the disintegration of Yugoslavia, the town of Srebrenica was designated a UN safe area for civilians. But nationalist Serb forces overran Srebrenica. They killed about 8,000 Muslim men and boys in the following days. Omerovic, with her mother and 2 children, ran from their village near Srebrenica for shelter in a UN compound on the night of July 11, 1995. Her husband tried to escape through the woods with other men. The news of his execution came days later. Dragana Vucetic is a forensic expert working on the identification of the Srebrenica victims. She said there are currently several thousand cases.
Srebrenica is an extremely complex project because a large number of victims had been buried on many different locations, in primary and secondary mass graves where bodies were dismembered. So we are not able to find complete bodies.
Ethnic divisions remain a source of tension in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was split into autonomous Bosniak, Croat, and Serb entities under the 1995 Dayton Peace Treaty. The massacre was declared a genocide by 2 international courts. The designation has been persistently denied by the leaders of Bosnian Serbs and by neighboring Serbia. Both question the number of victims.
Welcome back to the program. Now let's take a look at the front page of Daily Sabah. Mustafa, as we were watching in this news report, tomorrow we'll be marking the 30th anniversary of the Srebrenica genocide. Where do we stand, Mustafa? Thousands of families are still waiting to bury their loved ones. What's the latest situation here?
30 years ago, Serb leaders conducted genocide against Bosnian men in Srebrenica in front of the eyes of international community, and some international criminal courts are recognizing what happened in Srebrenica as a genocide, and it is clearly showing that right now the Bosnian families are pursuing international justice against genocide. We know that international criminal courts held accountable Serbian leaders for what happened in Srebrenica, but we know that international community should deal with that type of criminal actions worldwide. And right now, in front of the international community, there is also another genocide conducted by Israel in Gaza. we know that these families will continue to search for recovered bodies and remains of bodies to deal with their psychological problems. We know that Bosnian people are still suffering from what happened in Srebrenica 30 years ago. Turkey is also trying to increase international awareness about the genocidal acts by Serbian leaders and Israeli decision makers. I hope that the international community and international bodies, including the United Nations, will be able to deal with these type of criminal actions. But if we want to see international peace and security, I think that the United Nations will be supposed to reform itself, because right now 5 nations are controlling the United Nations Security Council, and these countries are the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia, and they are always vetoing any international action in terms of obstructing the positive works of the United Nations. That is the reason why Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is always saying that the world is bigger than 5. If we want to embrace a fairer world, I think the United Nations will be supposed to reform itself.
Mustafa, 30 years ago we saw international organizations and alliances failing. Even now, when we look at what's happening in the occupied Gaza Strip, we can see that international organizations like the UN and other alliances, international alliances, have failed to provide security and freedom to the Palestinians. Do you think that the United Nations is unwilling to reform itself? Because if it reforms, it's going to be more inclusive. Do you think that it has the ability, or is it lacking that ability to reform itself?
Mar, we know that the United Nations is eager to reform itself, but some members of the United Nations Security Council are obstructing the reform efforts, because they know that they will lose their privilege if the United Nations reform itself. Within this context, Turkey has been always taking important diplomatic steps in terms of increasing international awareness about the failures of the United Nations Security Council. I think that international community will continue to make pressure over the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, but I think that it is up to these countries to take steps in terms of reforming United Nations. Otherwise, the international bodies will continue to turn a blind eye to such criminal actions worldwide.
Mustafa, thanks for that analysis on the Srebrenica genocide and the state of international organizations today.
You are welcome.
Now let's take a look at this news report, and we'll be right back.
Inside Gaza City's Al-Helu hospital, the neonatal unit faces a crippling shortage of equipment and fuel. That means 4 at-risk newborns are crammed into a single incubator. Ziad Al-Masri is a pediatrician here.
There are 3 or 4 newborn babies in one incubator. It is designed to accommodate 1 child, 1 premature baby. Our situation is like a disaster. The cramming of children leads to the spread of illness and an inability to deal with them, and therefore leads to direct danger to them. We are in need of more incubators in order to deal with the number of newborn babies, and especially premature babies.
Israel's military operation has decimated health services in Gaza, and a blockade limiting food and medicine has led to a significant increase in malnutrition, threatening the health of pregnant mothers and newborns.
The majority of these cases suffer from malnutrition during the period inside the womb, and therefore the babies are born underweight and have underdeveloped lungs and underdeveloped bodies in general. They are in need of care from us due to the incomplete development of their bodies.
Overwhelmed medics say the dwindling fuel supplies threaten to plunge them into darkness, where health services have been pummeled during 21 months of war.
We are dealing with critical cases of newborn babies, especially premature babies. The majority of them are deprived of oxygen during birth, and they need ventilators to help stabilize them. We need continuous electricity 24 hours a day. If it is cut off, the equipment that we are using will cease to work, and this directly impacts the lives of the children we have.
An Israeli military official said around 160,000 liters of fuel destined for hospitals and other humanitarian facilities had entered Gaza since Wednesday, but that its distribution around the enclave was not under Israel's purview. Gaza's health ministry says Israel's response has killed over 57,000 Palestinians. It has also caused a hunger crisis, displaced almost all of Gaza's population, and prompted accusations of genocide and war crimes.
Welcome back to the program. Joining us now from the Turkish capital is John Kavulich. He's the senior research editor at Issue Insight. John, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Apologies for not being in studio.
It's okay, as long as we have you on the program, John. John, let's start with the meeting between Trump and Netanyahu. We've been seeing they've been holding talks on how to displace Gazans from the occupied Gaza Strip. But before we get into those discussions, John, I want to ask you about the ceasefire talks that are ongoing and are mediated by Qatar and are happening in Doha. What do you think is the success rate of those talks? Do you think that we could see a credible ceasefire coming from the Qatari capital?
I think we have to evaluate it in terms of good intentions, yes. Ceasefire, great. 60 days ceasefire, great. But what did Prime Minister Netanyahu say less than 48 hours ago? And that is ceasefire, 60-day ceasefire. But after the 60 days, if we don't have what we want, then the Israeli Defense Forces will start their activity again. So, you would hope that what you would hear from Prime Minister Netanyahu is that, yes, President Trump has been instrumental. Yes, the Qataris, the UAE, President Erdogan's, verbal communications and entreaties to everybody that, okay, we're in on the 60-day ceasefire, and on day 61, it doesn't mean we start firing again. It means we're going to continue to try. We're going to give this as much as possible. But no, he said, 61st day, we don't have everything we want, and we start firing and killing again.
John, how much pressure is Netanyahu facing from his own cabinet and from his coalition partners like Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich? How much pressure do you think that Netanyahu is under by them? And do you think that they are influential in devising this ceasefire? Do you think that they are influencing Netanyahu not to accept a ceasefire and to continue attacking the Palestinians?
Every country has its lunatic contingent within its political sphere, and Israel isn't the exception. They have lunatics on the left, they have lunatics on the right, and the current two lunatics that you just mentioned, they carry a lot of weight. And Prime Minister Netanyahu's government is basically 1 to 2 people in the Knesset. He has the corruption trial that anyone could sort of topple that, and so they're going to direct him, substantially. And we heard when he, at the working dinner at the White House, which you're showing now, when he turned around at his chair to talk to the media, and his basically, it was so flippant, but he basically said, we don't care in terms of what anybody thinks, two-state solution, whatever, we're going to do what we want to do. And so I think that the pressure he's getting is to continue fighting, because once all the hostages are out, dead or alive, the IDF, I think, is going to go in and waste whatever is left of Gaza, so that Israel can, and I know, using Nazi terms is always dangerous, but so some in the Israeli government can achieve their final solution, which, right now they're pushing the Gazans toward the Mediterranean. Defense Ministry said, no, now we're going to push them south towards Rafah. And what does that mean? It means that at some point, you're likely going to see a lot of Palestinians pushed right through the border into Egypt, and then we've got a crisis. And then what do the Egyptians do?
John, something that's very disturbing, and it's something that Prime Minister Netanyahu said yesterday in Washington when he met Trump, was that the Palestinians should have the freedom to leave. What do you make of this statement?
It was, like I said, Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit was just surreal with some of these moments. But yes, they should have the freedom to move. Okay, well, since October the 7th, How many of them have lined up at the border checkpoints between Gaza and Israel and said, hey, I'd like to go shopping. I'd like to check into the Marriott Hotel because we're having a little bit of an issue here with water and gas and electricity. It was astounding. And, and then you juxtapose that with, of course, President Trump saying, we want to take control of Gaza, the big, beautiful Gaza, the Riviera and the Mediterranean, Trump Tower, and along the water. But then to say they should have the right to go where they want to. Well, some of them want to either stay where they are, move to the West Bank, move into the proper state of Israel, and they're not being allowed to do that. It just... it's one of those moments where you say that you can't make it up, but he did make it up, and then he said it.
John, what do you make of the American policy in the Middle East at this point? What's your analysis? How are Israel and United States reshaping the entire policy in the Middle East?
President Trump, his inconsistency makes analysis very, very difficult. Because he can be with you in the morning, be against you at lunch, and then come back to you at dinner time. And then you repeat the next morning. So where you could see, all right, he was pushing Prime Minister Netanyahu to, quote, end it. But we need to go back and remember what he said early on in his term. He wanted Prime Minister Netanyahu to stop the bombing because it didn't look good. It wasn't that it was wrong. It wasn't that it was in violation of any treaties or international law. It wasn't that it would not accomplish what Israel wanted to accomplish. It doesn't look good on television. And so what we've seen with President Trump is he'll vacillate back and forth. Prime Minister Netanyahu gave him an opportunity to look really tough in Iran. He went, he looked good, the biggest, the most beautiful, the best bombing, ever. Did it accomplish the goal? No. Did it partially accomplish the goal? Perhaps. We still truly don't know. And what is Prime Minister Netanyahu already? The bombs weren't even hitting Iran when Prime Minister Netanyahu was saying to President Trump, keep bombing, and we've got to plan for more. So the transformational element to what President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, what they're laying the landscape for is no more Abraham Accord connectivity, because for most countries that's going to be a real problem, and also teeing up that when the killing stops and then the accountability starts, that all that's going to end up in courtrooms. And that's something that Israel isn't going to want, and that's something President Trump knows a lot about.
John, tell me about the latest reports emerging from the United States. Mahmoud Khalil, the Palestinian activist who was leading the pro-Palestine protests at Columbia University, has filed a $20 million lawsuit against the Trump administration. What sort of a precedent will this set when it comes to freedom of speech in the United States?
Well, we have a history of freedom of speech issues becoming lawsuits. In this particular case, it looks like he's going to file in New York, which the federal courts in New York, tend to be on the less conservative side. However, he was held in Alabama, where the federal courts there are incredibly conservative. We have a conservative Supreme Court, which is basically giving a lot of deference to the President of the United States with respect to conducting foreign policy, with respect to the obtaining and then holding and then removal of people from outside of the U.S., whether they've got green cards, passports, or whatever. So I don't think him prevailing is quite likely, but it will go through the court system. At some point, the U.S. government is going to seek to dismiss it, but he's got a good, capable legal team. He's going to get a lot of what are basically called amicus briefs, friends of the court, who are going to be submitting documents. But in the end, is he likely to prevail on the merits of the case, whether it's the freedom of speech components, him being held, without valid charges? I don't know. I think in this, our courts are not supposed to be political. We criticize other governments for having political courts, but this is a really politically charged case. So, I think I'm not really optimistic that he's going to end up prevailing once it makes it through the first round, the appellate round, and Supreme Court if it gets that far.
John Kavalich, thank you for being on the program. It was a pleasure listening to your analysis.
Thanks, sir.
Mustafa Kojakanar, Anews editor, thank you for being with us in the studio again and for that analysis on the latest developments.
Thank you very much.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.